name's Tom Ward. I'm a technical architect. I currently work for Accenture, or Cloud Sherpas. And this presentation today is kind of the result of maybe 6 months kind of playing around with Lightning Components and some of what I believe are probably some of the best practices or some of the ideas that I've kind of come up with over that time. And I guess maybe let's start with how many people in here have actually built any Lightning components so far? Okay. And how many people have done the trailheads? Okay, a few more. So I kind of think the next leap after maybe doing the trailheads is you kind of learn some of the basics. They throw a few examples out there and you kind of have to solve those. But I certainly had some questions, particularly around some of the more advanced features, when I'd use them, in what context. So this presentation is really aimed at answering those questions and hopefully sharing some of the learning that I've gone through. So what are we going to look at? There are kind of 5 areas, and these are kind of the topics that I want to speak about, but it is very much going to be put in context through examples. So the first one is how to dynamically create components. The second topic is how you might build a complex component out of smaller ones, so breaking down a bigger problem into smaller parts. The third one is about communicating with component events. So there's 2 types of events in Lightning, and I really wanted to focus on this one because it took me a little bit longer to understand when to use it and how to use it properly. The fourth one is how to invoke a method on a child component, and then the last is how to increase component reusability with action attributes. So let's go with the first one then. So maybe one of the first things I came across actually when doing Lightning components is I was building components very much in isolation. And I thought, this is great, but how do I start putting these together? How do I build a larger application that might include multiple pages? So to put that into context, this example is kind of ripping off the London's Calling website a little bit. But essentially what I've got here is kind of, we're going to have a home page, and then we're going to have several sub-tabs. And the question really is, how are we going to navigate around this application? So as you might be aware, Lightning Framework is really about sort of single-page apps. So in this example, London's Calling is the app, and then we have a few other kind of subcomponents working around here. So, for instance, we've got the page tab list, so that's representing the pages that you can navigate to, and we've kind of got the body of the app itself, which is the page that's going to change as you click on each of those tabs. And one of the kind of key things that's up here is that we're going to use events to do that navigation. So when I click on schedule, for instance, it's going to fire a navigate to page event, and that's going to go up to the London's Calling app, which is then going to re-render this body component with the new page. So what does that kind of look like? So digging into the code a little bit here, so we can see kind of a couple of key pieces. So on lines 4 and 5, we've kind of got the initialization of the component itself. On 5, we've kind of got the handler for the navigate to page event. So we might be receiving this either from the app itself, or it could even be from subcomponents within the app. And as I mentioned, we've got there's a chance that the actual app itself raises this event. So we're also registering the event here. And then just to walk through a little bit of the code below, we can kind of see the logo and some of the page tabs defined. So let's go a little bit deeper again. So how do we actually create those components? So the first thing you'll notice is that when we initialize the application, we actually fire an event straight away. And this is because we want to default the page when we first load the app. So what we can see here is we're creating a navigate to page events on line 4. We're setting the parameter, which is essentially telling the application which page we want to render. And then we're going to fire it. And then immediately below, you can see there's the handler to that navigate to page event on line 9. And what this is doing is this is the bit that's dynamically creating the component. It's then going to inject it into the body, replacing whatever was there before. So it's really quite simple in some ways. We create the component method, So there's the $a.create components. We pass in the name of the component that we want, and you'll see those couple of curly brackets that are empty. That would be how we set any attributes of the actual component. In this case, we're not setting any. We're just going to render it straight out without doing anything. But if you did want to set some, that's where you would put them. If we look at that, the definition, I guess, of that method a little bit closer, this is just taken from the documentation, but kind of just demonstrates how you might pass some of those attributes. So in this case, it's creating a UI button, and it's passing in a press attribute, which is a reference to a parent function, in this case, handle press. So that kind of answers the first problem. When might you use dynamically? When might you use the dynamic creation of components? And kind of shows page navigation as an example of why you might do that. The next one is how do we build complex components out of smaller ones? So in this example, I'm going to walk through a data table, and I've got some requirements for this data table. The first of which is that I want to pass in an object or an S object. So that could be something I've created in JavaScript, or I could have maybe sockled out a set of accounts or something like that. I want to specify which columns I want to show. So in some cases, I might have a record that I've retrieved from Salesforce that has maybe 8 or 9 fields. Maybe I don't want to show all of those, so I'm going to say which ones I want. And I want to allow row selection. So might be a little bit faint, but against each of these rows is a tick box, which allows you to select one or more of these. And how am I going to do this then? So the next feature I'm going to kind of introduce or talk about is facets. And facets are really a way that you can build more complex components out of subcomponents and kind of specify all of that when you create it. So this snippet of code is from the schedule page component. And what it shows is at the outer layer, it's using a data table. And then actually inside of that, it's putting in data table columns, and it's all kind of defined in one chunk together. So facets, kind of definition, is a component attribute of type aura component. So essentially it's a subcomponent. We use the aura set to assign a value to the facet. And it basically, as I said, provides the ability to inject components into one another to build something more complex. So if we take a look at our data table, we'll actually find that it's made up of a number of different subcomponents. It's got the data table columns, rows, and cells. And what this highlighting is attempting to do is kind of show you where each of those sort of sub-elements are on the data table. So what does this look like? So this is the data table component itself. And we can see a few kind of attributes declared at the top. So in sort of lines 2 to 6, we're basically passing in some attributes. So the rows, which is our object array, could be an S object array equally. We pass in the columns, and as you can see, that's the aura.component array. So that's the subcomponents that we're going to pass into this thing. We've then got a few other attributes for things like showing the checkboxes, and also a attribute called selected rows, which is our means of passing back information to the parent component about which ones have actually been selected. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is that actually by breaking your components up, you make the problem a little bit simpler. You just focus on key areas. I kind of liken it very much to like object-oriented programming, where you typically have methods that focus on one thing and one thing only. It's good if you can kind of treat your components the same way, such that you don't end up with some 2,000-line component that's really hard to manage and offers every single capability under the sun. Think about breaking them down and making them a bit simpler and easier to maintain. Okay, so the next feature I want to sort of talk about is how to communicate a component up the component hierarchy using events. So those of you who have kind of done a bit of Lightning programming before will be kind of familiar with the fact that there's two types of event. There's the application events, and if you fire one of these, you're essentially broadcasting that event to every component in the hierarchy, and they may choose to handle it or not. Component events are a little bit different. So typically, you'll fire a component event, and what this diagram is illustrating is that for instance, if page tab component doesn't choose to handle that, it'll then bubble up to the next layer. That has an opportunity to handle it, so the page tab list. And then if that doesn't handle it, it goes right back up to the London's Calling app. And ultimately, given my first example, that's what we wanted. We wanted a clicker to listen to that click event, and then fire a navigate to page event that went all the way back up to the top of the app, and then change the page. So there is a little bit of a problem with this, though, sometimes. So if I was building up this page tab list component, probably the natural way that I'd want to do it is actually using facets. So wouldn't it be great if I could define something a little bit like the lines you can see here on 15 to 18, where essentially I have the wrapper page tab list, and then nested inside I've got the page tab components themselves. Great, that would make life so easy. Before I move on, though, I'll just talk about what I'm trying to achieve with this component, and that's 3 requirements. So it should be made up of 1 or more page tabs. It should fire the navigate to page event. And the final one, which is the one that's going to be a little bit trickier, is it should indicate when the tab is in focus. So naturally, when you click on a tab, you only want one of those to be highlighted blue. The others should indicate that they're not the page that you're currently on. So why can't I use facets here? Well, what's the sort of problem that I encounter? And there's this line that you might have read in the developer guide that when I first read it probably didn't make a lot of sense to me. But it's essentially saying that component events actually bubble up through the containment hierarchy. And as I said, that didn't make much sense to me, so I'm going to kind of explain it here. So if I had used facets, I would have defined the page tab list and the page tab all within the context of the London's Calling app. It's all in one block of code. And that's what it means by containment hierarchy. So what would actually happen is when I click on that schedule page tab, that event completely bypasses the page tab list and goes straight up to the London's Calling app. So the problem I have is that whilst I've satisfied 2 requirements, that I can make it out of 1 or more tabs and that it should fire the navigate to page event, it doesn't satisfy the third one, because ideally I want to change the focus. And there are a few options available for how I might do that. The first is I could just implement the logic in the London's Calling app, but I don't really like that. That kind of breaks the rules of encapsulation, which says that my page tab list should really kind of contain all the logic that should handle the kind of navigation of the tabs. If I defer that to the London's Calling app, every time I want to use this component, I'm going to have to re-implement that logic elsewhere. So that's not great. I could use application events. And I kind of would have gone down this route probably in the first couple of months of programming with Lightning. But it didn't feel like a best practice to me. You're essentially broadcasting that information out to everyone. And I always think that particularly where an event might be highly reusable, something like a button click, for instance, there's always a risk that some other component might be listening to that event and potentially even mishandle it or misfire some logic. Equally, all of the handlers that kind of listen to that event are going to run their logic even if they don't do anything with it. So I would imagine there's probably going to be some sort of performance impact from doing that. So it would be a lot better if I can just use component events properly. So how would I do this? So in this instance, I've not used facets. So if you look at line 17, you can see there's the page tab list component. And actually what I'm doing is just passing in an attribute. And if you go to the top of the page, lines 3 to 5, you can see there's a definition for those page tabs. And that's an object array, and inside of it, it's essentially got the 2 tabs that I want to display. And it's pretty much the same information that was on the nested component before. So how does that work then? So once I've passed that information in to my page tab list, you can say it's iterating over that object and then instantiating the page tab. And that's the key. That page tab is now contained within the page tab list. So when we talk about containment hierarchy, the page tab list is now the container. Which means the event will fire through the page tab list, and I can intercept it. And as this bit of code on the right shows, I can change the focus of the tabs. Okay, what's the next one? So the next example I'm going to show is building a reusable modal component. So this kind of screenshot here, essentially what it's showing is that I've got my schedule page, I've got an add button, and what I want to do is when I click on that add button, I want to pop up a modal, I want to capture some information on an event, I want to validate it, and then when I click on OK, it should save it and update the table. Now, if I start to think about reusability, I have the following requirements. So if this modal could be used in any context, it's important that the footer and the body could be anything. Likewise, it's important that the trigger for opening the modal could be anything, and that the logic that sits behind the OK and cancel buttons, again, isn't defined, because it's very much going to be the responsibility of the parent component to define the behavior. In this particular instance, so for the London's Calling app, what I'm trying to achieve, as I mentioned, is the modal should collect information on events, it should pop open when someone clicks add, and it should validate and save it. So how would I do that? So the first requirement I can solve pretty easily by using facets again. So you can see here lines 41 to 43 that I'm setting the header, and then the rest of it is essentially setting the body by injecting a form component that I've built, which in turn is made up of form elements, and inside that are the actual input fields. So that quite quickly solves the first problem, but how do I go about the second one, which is triggering the modal? So the piece of functionality I'm going to use for this is actually the aura method tag. And what this basically does is it allows the container component to call a method on the child. So in this case, the modal is going to be that child component. That's going to be what the schedule page is using. So the methods I want are the open and close. So I want the parent to be able to open and close that. And as you can see here, I've defined them as aura methods. Now, in this instance, I haven't actually passed any attributes at all, but there is a capability to do so. So the little snippet here, which is from the developer guide, kind of shows how you would pass information into those methods so that they can use that to determine whatever logic you need. Okay, so if I have a little bit of a look at the code on the schedule page controller, we can see that there's an open modal method. And in the initialize section above, we've basically set a local reference to our modal component and stored it as an attribute. And then when we need it later, we click on the add button, which invokes this open modal method. And it literally simply gets a reference to the modal and says .open. So that's that method that I've exposed. So I've now got that capability. And likewise, I can use the same sort of behavior for close. So that's the second requirement taken off the list. So we've just got one left, and that's essentially what we do when we hit the OK or cancel button. How do we define that behavior? So the attribute that we're going to use here is actually of type aura.action. And what this allows, essentially, is for us to pass an entire function in from our parent component into the child component. So what you can see here on lines 4 through 6 are 3 actions. There's a cancel, a close, and an OK action. We've defaulted it just to closing the modal, but what we're expecting, as we can see in the block of code below, is on the schedule page, we're actually injecting functions from the schedule page controller into that modal. So we're going to insert the new event on OK, and we're going to cancel a new event in the event of when we cancel or close the modal. So digging a little bit deeper into that code, we can see what happens when we click on those buttons. So starting from line 14, we've got the insert new event, and essentially that's just using the helper class to perform a bit of validation. And assuming it's valid, it's then going to write that information to Salesforce using the server-side controller, and it's going to refresh the table. If we cancel the new event, we are going to reset the form and close the modal. So essentially we've got, using both those functions, we have now completely built out our modal in the context of the London's Calling app, and we have essentially satisfied all three requirements from both the kind of generic modal side, but also from the London's Calling app. So hopefully what I've demonstrated is kind of like 5 kind of core features, maybe how they could be used in like real life situations. There'll be plenty more use cases out there. But I think, as I said at the start, for me, it was really about learning these things without much context. With examples, I think it makes a lot more sense. You know, when would you use them? So hopefully you'll walk out of this room with a little bit more information on when to use these and how to use these. I'll take question and answers, but it's worth mentioning that all of the code that sits behind this app sits on GitHub. So you probably want to go away, digest what I've said, and maybe have a look at the code. And I guess over to you guys for any questions at all on this. And how do I feel about using the dev console in particular? Or I tried to use Maven's Mate, actually. That's my kind of preferred IDE. But unless someone can move for me a bit away, it seems a bit clunky at the moment in terms of its support for Lightning components. You have to install like another library essentially to get it to work. So you're kind of using the Maven's Mate plugin for one bit and then a Lightning plugin for the other. Didn't like that. I probably a bit more sold on maybe trying to use the Cloud9 IDE that I saw in a presentation earlier from Chris. Yeah, I noticed that it supported it, looked a lot cleaner. I think particularly when you start to scale up with like lots of components, it's pretty much unmanageable in the dev console because you're constantly moving right and left across all those tabs trying to find the ones you're working with, especially when you follow my best practice of breaking components up. You'll have a bit of difficulty with that, I think. Okay. I started off with the Trailheads, actually. So I'd done a bit of JavaScript programming before, but not a whole lot. It's probably limited to like jQuery and a few other kind of libraries that just help me out now and again with Visualforce. So in the first instance, if you haven't done the Trailheads, particularly the Lightning Components one is, I actually think, really good. It actually forces you to think. It forces you to actually solve problems in a way that some of the Trailheads don't. So I think if you work your way through that, you'll get a lot of takeaway from it. The other bit that was actually really useful wasn't the Lightning Component Trailhead, but there's a section in the Trailheads called Projects, and there's one under there called for the SLDS, actually. And I think that was the first Trailhead that really got me thinking about how pretty much everything should be looked at as a component and like really breaking down your applications into much smaller parts. It really kind of demonstrated to me, SVG is a component, a button's a component. As you saw here, things like page tabs, everything is componentized. And I think if you go down that track and start thinking that way, although there might be a little bit more effort up front in terms of making those as components, you'll reap the rewards later on. So things like the modal, for instance, it would have been very easy just to build out a very particular use case that was just the London's Calling app on that page. But I bet you I would have ended up re-implementing the same thing like 10, 20 times ultimately. So if you can kind of think about how you can make things reusable, and componentize right from the start, I think you'll save a lot of time. I think then the other thing is probably just practice, really. When I first started writing these things like 6 months ago, I was constantly hitting bugs, constantly debugging. But now I'd probably say that I can write a fair bit of code without constantly, console.logging out what I'm doing. It's more often than not, I get it right first time now. So I think there is just an experience. So I think I'd encourage anyone who's interested just to keep practicing, really. Try and think about real problems that you can kind of solve. I think that's the way to go. I mean, there's so much out there on the net about JavaScript. So if you kind of just want any more just like generic JavaScript learning, you could go to things like Code Academy or other places. And I guess there's probably plenty of GitHub projects you can look at. I think Salesforce has certainly got one, which is trying to build out the Lightning Design System components. So take a look at those. And actually another one that I looked at was the whole Aura framework is on GitHub as well. So although some of the UI components that you see today in Lightning are exposed, there are a whole lot more there. And you can go have a look at the code behind those and see how the people who built the Aura framework and the UI namespace are actually doing these things to kind of start getting a good idea about what might be best practice. So I think, does that answer it? Cool. Yes, Chris. Yeah.